In 1306, an entire market town sank beneath a Danish lake. Not a slow decline, not abandonment, gone. And for 700 years, people argued about whether it ever existed at all. Here's what makes this stranger than it sounds. The lake in question, Arresø in northern Zealand, is the largest lake in Denmark. It sits there today, calm, unremarkable, visited by kayakers and birdwatchers. But underneath that still water, on the lakebed, something has been waiting. And when Scandinavian archaeologists finally looked closely enough, what they found stopped them cold. We'll get to that. But first, you need to understand the world this town was born into. It's the early 13th century. Northern Zealand is growing fast. Trade routes are expanding. Small market towns are sprouting along waterways across Scandinavia. A settlement near the waters of what would become Arresø is thriving. Some historical sources refer to the broader area around Tibirke and the region near Æbelholt Abbey as a hub of local commerce. Merchants, pilgrims, a monastery drawing travelers from across Denmark. Æbelholt Abbey itself was famous. Founded in the 12th century, it became one of the most significant Augustinian monasteries in all of Scandinavia. Its abbot, Wilhelm of Æbelholt, was later canonized as a saint. People came from hundreds of miles away seeking healing, seeking trade, seeking God. And around that gravity, a community grew. Now here's the first question worth sitting with. If this settlement was real, thriving, documented in monastery chronicles, why did it vanish from the map? The answer involves water, and it's more complicated than you'd think. Medieval Denmark was not geologically stable, not in the way we casually assume land to be stable. The region around northern Zealand experienced gradual land subsidence, the slow, almost imperceptible sinking of the earth itself. At the same time, the water levels of inland lakes were not fixed. They rose and fell across centuries, responding to climate shifts, to changes in drainage, to the slow press of geology. What was dry ground in 1200 was not guaranteed to be dry ground in 1400. Local chronicles began noting something troubling. Buildings near the water, then closer to the water, then in the water. But chronicles are tricky sources. Medieval writers mixed memory, miracle, and metaphor. When a monk wrote that a town had been swallowed by the lake, was he recording fact? Invoking divine punishment? Embellishing a dimly remembered flood? For centuries, that ambiguity let skeptics dismiss the whole story. No town, they said, just folklore, just monks with dramatic imaginations. And that's where things stood for a long, long time. But folk memory is a stubborn thing. The people living around Arresø never stopped believing something was down there. Fishermen reported snagging their nets on what felt like timber, like stone. Local legends named the drowned settlement, described its streets, its market days. Generation after generation, the story survived in exactly the way stories survive when they're rooted in something true. In the early 20th century, Scandinavian archaeologists began taking these accounts seriously. Not credulously, seriously. That's an important distinction. Taking a legend seriously means asking, what would we expect to find if this were real? And then looking. The lakebed of Arresø is not easy to investigate. It's shallow in places, silted, ecologically sensitive. Early survey attempts were limited, frustrating, inconclusive. But the tools were improving, and the questions weren't going away. Here's what the researchers were looking for. Medieval settlements leave signatures. Post holes where structures stood, midden heaps, refuse piles, that preserve organic material for centuries. Artifacts, ceramics, metal fittings, worked bone. The quiet debris of ordinary life. In a waterlogged, oxygen-poor environment like a lakebed, organic material can survive extraordinarily well. Wood that would rot in open air can sit preserved in lake sediment for 700 years. That's both the challenge and the promise of underwater archaeology. If the town was real, the evidence might still be there, sealed under silt, waiting. And this is where the story shifts. Because when modern underwater survey work began focusing on specific areas of the Arresø lakebed, they found anomalies. Features that didn't fit the natural geology of the lake floor. Regular shapes, patterns. The kind of thing water doesn't make on its own. Investigations confirmed the presence of wooden structures on the lake bed. Timbers, worked and shaped by human hands. Artifacts recovered from the sediment matched the material culture of medieval Denmark. Ceramics consistent with 13th and 14th century production. Not washed in from shore, not scattered randomly. Distributed in patterns that suggested settlement, organization, human life. 700 years of doubt settled on the lake bed of Denmark's largest lake. The folk memory was right. Something had been there, and the water had taken it. Now, how exactly did it happen? This is where historians are careful. Some scholars believe the submersion was not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual process. Water levels rising slowly over decades, residents retreating incrementally, buildings abandoned as flooding became permanent. The drama of the story, the 1306 date, the single sinking, may reflect how memory compresses slow disaster into a single moment. That's something humans do. We need events to have edges, beginnings and endings. A town that slowly got wetter over 50 years is harder to mourn than a town that vanished in a night. But other historians point to evidence of more abrupt change. Land subsidence in the region was not always gradual. Periods of faster settling have been documented. And a severe flooding event in the early 14th century, consistent with the dates preserved in local chronicles, cannot be ruled out. The honest answer is probably both. Gradual vulnerability, then a tipping point. The slow weakening of a place, then the final surrender to the water. This pattern shows up again and again in the archaeology of lost settlements. In coastal erosion, in river flooding, in lake rise. Places don't usually die in an instant. They usually die slowly and then suddenly. Think about what that means for the people who live there. Not a biblical flood, not a wall of water in the night. More likely, a spring that didn't fully recede, a market square that flooded every year, then every season, then stayed wet. Decisions made family by family. Where do we go? What do we take? The monastery at Æbelholt itself was not submerged. It stood for centuries more before its dissolution during the Danish Reformation in the 16th century. But the commercial heart that had grown up in its shadow, the traders, the market, the small, dense community that medieval pilgrimage routes had fed, that was gone, relocated, scattered, swallowed. And the lake closed over it and kept its secret. There's something worth pausing on here. We tend to think of history as the things that were written down, the documents that survived, the buildings still standing. But most of human experience left no document, no stone, no archive. It left only ground and sometimes water. The people who fished Arresø and snagged their nets on timber, they were doing a kind of archaeology without knowing it. They were preserving knowledge, passing it forward in the only medium they had, story. For centuries, academic history looked at those stories and said, probably nothing. And the fishermen kept snagging their nets. The lesson isn't that every legend is true. It isn't. The lesson is that when a community maintains a specific, detailed, consistent memory across hundreds of years, that memory deserves a question mark, not a dismissal. Oral tradition and folk memory have now vindicated themselves in archaeological site after site across the world. Arresø is one more entry in that long, humbling list. The underwater findings around the Tibirke area and the former shorelines of Arresø remain an active area of interest for Danish archaeologists. Survey technology continues to improve. Ground-penetrating sonar, photogrammetric mapping of the lake bed. There is almost certainly more to find. The full shape of the settlement, its extent, its population, its relationship to the abbey, is still being pieced together. Which means the story isn't over. Somewhere under that calm lake, under the kayakers and the birdwatchers, under 700 years of silt and silence, there are more answers. And Danish archaeology is still looking. The town that skeptics said never existed is slowly giving itself back. One timber, one ceramic shard, one small confirmation that the people who remembered were right to remember. That's what makes this story matter beyond the mystery. It's a reminder that the past doesn't disappear, it waits. And sometimes, if you take the legends seriously enough to look, it surfaces. If you want more stories like this, the forgotten places, the buried cities, the histories that survived only in rumor until someone finally dug, subscribe. There's more waiting beneath the surface.